It's a pleasure to introduce our second speaker, MacKinnon, who is the Vice Chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas, and somebody with a huge amount of experience in biodiversity, having worked as a biodiversity specialist with the World Bank in Washington, and currently very much involved in working on Global Protected Areas program and on the World Commission on Protected Areas Climate Change Task Force. So again, the theme of climate change coming through strongly. And to me, Kathy's also well known as a board member of BGCI. So please welcome MacKinnon.
Good morning. Well, I have to confess I'm not a botanist. I'm a zoologist by training, and most of my life I've worked on protected areas. And in that context, I have had the pleasure of visiting Sichuan-Bana, but not the Botanic Garden. I believe that protected areas and botanic gardens have a lot in common, and we should be working more closely together, particularly on the issue of restoration. We're living in a planet under pressure. We know all the usual suspects: habitat loss, fragmentation, overexploitation, spread of invasives, pollution, everything being further compounded by climate change. Already, according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 60% of natural ecosystems are degraded. So we're talking not so much about protecting what is left, although that's important, but we really need to start looking to the future to consider how can we restore what has been lost. And to do that, we have to make biodiversity conservation really relevant to the big issues that are going to face us over the coming decades. Of course, biodiversity loss is one of them, but there'll also be water and food security and increased vulnerability, largely due to climate change. The global community seems to have finally agreed that climate change exists, but there's still no agreement on how high temperatures may rise. Even at a modest 2 degrees centigrade rise, there will be considerable impacts. We can expect falling crop yields in many areas, particularly developing countries. We are already seeing some glacier melt. We can expect significant decreases in water availability in many regions, including the Mediterranean, South Asia, Southern Africa. Many of the major cities of the world, especially those lying on the coast, are going to have to face the threat of sea level rise. There'll be damage to ecosystems. We're already seeing that with coral reefs. And we're already seeing more extreme weather events and a greater frequency of those events. And there will be tremendous impacts on human communities and livelihoods. If we look at Africa, for instance, where 2/3 is described as desert or drylands, already 75% of those agricultural drylands are degraded. By 2020, 75 to 250 million people may be suffering water shortages. Some countries are going to see a 50% reduction yield from rain-fed agriculture. And that's going to undermine efforts to address poverty. It's going to lead to more food insecurity, and it's going to lead to further human migration. Asia, there's a similar picture. There'll be concerns over freshwater availability. Coastal areas, especially the heavily populated delta regions, are going to be at risk of flooding. And we're going to see massive agricultural expansion, including for biofuel production. And that's going to put increased pressure on natural habitats. And there'll be disease spread too, especially of waterborne diseases. The islands, as we know, are likely to suffer from sea level rise and increased invasion by non-native species. So biodiversity will be under threat, but natural ecosystems can also be part of the solution. We know, for instance, that natural ecosystems are storing carbon and sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere. Although forests only cover 35% of the land, They are storing something like 50% of terrestrial carbon and removing 2.4 billion tons a year, which is equivalent to 1/3 of all fossil fuel emissions. Drylands, grasslands are equally important, and area for area, coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrass beds are even more efficient at storing carbon. Land conversion, conversely, and deforestation and degradation are leading to something like 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So while our politicians debate on how to reduce those emissions, we need to be thinking seriously about how we can take action to better protect and restore natural ecosystems. It's interesting for me, for instance, to know that a conservative estimate is that globally 15% of terrestrial carbon is stored in protected areas. If we just look at the Amazon region, where there's now a large complex of 30 million hectares of protected areas under all kinds of different governance systems, including indigenous reserves. That area has a carbon stock estimated at 4.5 billion tons of carbon, and it's expected that further reduced emissions can be estimated at 1.8 billion tons. Protection of the Amazon region is a major part of Brazil's strategy to address climate change. Adaptation will become an even more important part of the development agenda moving forward. And we know that natural ecosystems are perfect in buffering climate, reducing disaster risk, and providing and maintaining essential ecosystem services. A global study of 105 major cities around the world showed that 1/3 of them were deriving their domestic water from forest-protected areas. That includes Jakarta, New York, Quito, Melbourne, many others. Another 10% get good quality domestic water from forested watersheds. We're talking about big cities, cities like Mumbai. Natural ecosystems are also contributing to food security by maintaining nurseries of fisheries and wildlife and protecting reservoirs of wild crop relatives. And healthy ecosystems restrict the spread of invasive alien species and disease vectors. And best of all, these are sustainable solutions. They're proven, they're long-term, they're green, they're cost-effective. What's not to like? An economic study of the value of forests in Madagascar led to the then president of Madagascar tripling the area of protected areas in 2003 from 2 million hectares to 6 million. Several of those protected areas can be justified on all kinds of socio-economic grounds, as well as for biodiversity values. This is just one new protected area, the Ambositra Vonderosa Forest Corridor, where we get carbon storage, water that's valuable for domestic use, hydro, and for protecting the irrigation of downstream crops. Medicinal plants contribute to health security. There are cultural services. And then, of course, there are remarkable biodiversity values. I know that some botanic gardens are working on some of these new protected areas. Peter tells me Missouri is now engaged with several of these. Natural ecosystems can also protect against hazards and reduce risk of disaster. We know that coral reefs and mangroves provide coastal protection. One restoration effort in Vietnam for restoration of mangroves at a cost of just over $1 million has been estimated to save over $7 million a year in sea dike repair, and is credited with reducing the damage to inland communities from Typhoon Wukong in 2000. The value of Swiss forests in stopping avalanches, landslides, and flooding is estimated between $2 to $3.5 billion a year. The Sundarbans in Bangladesh and India stabilize wetlands buffer coastlines, and protect inland communities from cyclones. And a major World Bank project in Argentina for flood control complemented investments in hard infrastructure and new canals and early warning systems with protection of riverine forests along the Paraná River. The addition to the project, which was a $400 million project, was $4 million. So for a 1% investment, a green infrastructure was incorporated into the whole program with a benefit for biodiversity as well as for sustainability. So what do we need to do? We need to protect, connect, and restore. We need more and larger landscapes protected. We need to improve management for carbon, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. But we need to think seriously about how we restore degraded habitats for all of those services and connectivity. And as a conservation community, we need to communicate much better, all about the social and economic values of natural ecosystems. And we need to be out there pushing policymakers to promote green infrastructure and natural solutions. And to do that, we need champions, including botanic gardens, and partnerships. We need to move from advocacy to action. There's now quite a literature on how ecosystem-based approaches to climate change can really help, including one publication by IUCN and others on protected areas, helping people to cope with climate change. So what does this imply for ecosystem management? Those of you who know Cape Town will know that there is a botanic garden and a national park in this picture, working closely together. At the political level, the Convention on Biological Diversity has approved a new strategic plan with 20 IHE targets. Target 11 is specifically about protecting habitats and has ambitious targets: 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas. And the requirement is that these should be ecologically representative and well connected. If you look at the reality, you can see where we are at the moment. Of all the terrestrial ecoregions, less than 1/3 meet the 17% target. Things are worse for marine ecoregions. If we look at connectivity between protected areas, we can also see there's very low connectivity. So increasingly, protected areas are becoming small, isolated areas, islands in a production landscape. So clearly, just protecting what is left is not enough. I want to emphasize again, we need to restore what has already been lost. And to do that, we need to take a landscape approach. We're already looking at how to better mainstream protected areas into development and land use planning. We're emphasizing through TEEB and other studies the value of ecosystem services. But really the big challenge is going to be how do we go about restoring biological corridors and degraded habitats. Again, the CBD recognizes the importance of restoration. There are 2 targets under the IHE targets for ecosystem restoration, including at least 15% of degraded ecosystems and ecosystems that provide essential services. The Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which has been championed and promoted by the Botanic Gardens, also recognizes ecosystem restoration, and 2 of the 16 targets reflect on the importance of that activity. And there is also the newly created Ecological Restoration Alliance, which is being led by several major botanic gardens, and we hope that others will join. There are many reasons to restore habitat: to safeguard biodiversity, to mitigate the effects of natural disasters. At this very moment in Sendai in Japan, the Japanese government is investing in large-scale ecosystem restoration of coastal wetlands and forests. The Japanese pride themselves on being some of the best prepared people for disasters, but were shocked and horrified by what happened after the tsunami. And so they really are making a special effort to restore natural habitats for coastal protection. This will be a new national park. We've already seen for many years efforts to restore watersheds, efforts to recreate coastal protection. Or you can indeed have efforts, and we heard a lot about this yesterday, for restoration to contribute to sustainable livelihoods and economic opportunities. Many efforts address many of these facets. Chris Willis talked a little bit about weeds that South Africa gave the world, but South Africa also has given the world some startling and amazing examples of how to effect restoration. The Working for Water program is one such program. South Africa has a tremendous problem with invasive alien species. Many of them are Australian in origin. When the post-apartheid government came into government, the scientific community, based on a lot of good research, made a case to the Minister for Water Affairs. And that case was all about, if you remove invasive alien species, you'll increase needed water supplies for irrigation and domestic use. You won't need to create so many reservoirs and dams, so you can reduce the costs of infrastructure. And best of all, you can create an employment program for disenfranchised people. This is one of the best examples of mainstreaming biodiversity in development anywhere in the world. It's a win-win situation. You get better water supplies, you address poverty alleviation, and of course biodiversity is the ultimate winner in the world's smallest floral kingdom. And that very successful program, which is now running on a budget of over $100 million a year, has also led to creation of other programs, working for wetlands and working against fire. So what can Botanic Gardens do? Well, we've heard a lot of inspiring stories here this week. We know Botanic Gardens are maintaining native species for restoration. You have good science, good capacity. You can take a lead on explaining how to restore degraded habitats. Many gardens are already engaged in doing that at pilot sites. You're working with communities. You have tremendous outreach. You can mobilize attention against invasives. You can tell the stories, the success stories, of where restoration has worked and why it's important to do it. The Ecological Restoration Alliance has an ambitious target of restoring 100 sites. 25 of those have already been identified. I do encourage you to go on the website. Already there are projects in Jordan working on drylands, in Kenya at Brockenhurst, restoring tropical forests, in Pakistan, restoring dryland forests, in southern China, working with communities, and also in many European and American contexts. But many of these activities are small scale, and we need to learn from them how to scale up. And to do that, we need partnerships. Partnerships with protected areas, partnerships with the private sector, partnerships such as Kings Park has with Alcoa in Western Australia. So in that spirit of partnership, I want to invite you all to come to the 6th World Parks Congress in Australia next year. The theme is Parks, People, Planet, Inspiring Solutions. It should be a great event. The intent is to reposition protected areas within the goals of economic and community well-being, make them relevant. Jin Shen talked about this in the context of Botanic Gardens. We want to understand better the importance of protected areas in conserving biodiversity and delivering ecosystem services. We want to demonstrate how this can be achieved. Not just tell people what to do, but how to do it, and to develop new partnerships and commitments. The three segments of the pie in the center really reflect the IUCN program for the next quadrennial period, valuing and conserving biodiversity, governance, and nature-based solutions. The 8 themes around the outside of the circle are the themes of the streams at the World Parks Congress. Everything from reaching conservation goals to supporting human life and respecting indigenous and traditional knowledge and culture. It seems to me from all the things I've heard here this week that many of those themes are relevant to the work that you do in Botanic Gardens. And Botanic Gardens are inspiring places. You're connecting people to nature. You have tremendous communications and outreach, opportunities to inspire new generations, urban communities, new immigrants, really reconnecting people to nature, educating the public about key conservation issues, and promoting understanding on how conserving plant diversity can deliver ecosystem services. And as well as that, of course, you have the opportunity to demonstrate restoration at local scales. So these are just some of the streams. Probably you look at them and think that they're all relevant to work that's happening in your botanic garden. But it seems to me that at least there should be opportunities to collaborate on stream 1, especially on restoration issues, on the stream 3, which is about improving health and well-being. This is a stream being led by Parks Victoria, building on their work with Healthy Parks, Healthy People, where they're also working with the insurance and medical sectors. And finally, stream 8, inspiring a new generation, connecting people to nature. And then I also want to echo something that Jin Shed said about how we need to develop capacity. We need to work together to really explore the lessons learned and experiences from restoration activities and see how together we can move the restoration agenda forward, because that will be a critical agenda for the next few decades. So please come to the Parks Congress. It's Parks, People, Planet, inspiring places, inspiring people, inspiring solutions. That's what conservation is all about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy, for a really inspiring talk and for reminding us that climate change is not somehow about some atmospheric chemistry set of gases, but something about the life processes of our planet. Anyway, we have time for 1 or 2 very quick questions. Yeah.
Works hopefully, yeah, more than that. Thank you very much for addressing also the aspect in Vietnam, because we as Botanic Garden Delft initiated this program. And what I want to know is, to what extent can your commission help to spread out this kind of information of habitat restoration, but also as an effective low-cost defense to the whole area? Because we really have this topic done now and is in progress in Vietnam, but we really want to ensure that it goes further on. To what extent can I expect help from you?
Well, thank you very much. I heard your talk yesterday, so it's very exciting what you're doing in Vietnam. My commission is a voluntary commission. All the 6 IUCN commissions are voluntary. So what happens in that context is best practice guidelines are produced and are circulated. IUCN itself does have programs that are involved in various different activities, including coastal protection in some places. There's a big project in the Pacific, for instance, on mangrove restoration, which you may be familiar with. But I do encourage you to talk with the local IUCN office in Vietnam if your interests are specific to that country.
Okay, well, thank you
Great.
once again, Kathy, for